eco-village, built an eco-village in Wandsworth in Surrey. Sorry, not in Surrey, in Wandsworth, by Wandsworth Bridge. The original squatters, there was a sort of doppelganger group that turned up afterwards, but we did it in 1996 for 6 months. And a guy turned up there and said, "Oh, did you know that the world is run by the Bilderbergs?" And I was just joking, but I dutifully wrote, I thought he was joking, dutifully wrote down this name, and I searched for it on Reuters, and I found a whole list of names, and I thought, well, crikey, this isn't even on the internet. So I cut and pasted this thing from Reuters onto the internet, and that was the beginning of the Bilderberg website.
Does the origination of the Bilderberg come from the royal lines, as an example?
Well, it's certainly connected with the elite, and of course the feudal system, which was really brought in by the Normans, 1066. This hierarchy with the king at the top, the dukes and the duchesses, the marquises, the princesses, the princes, and that idea of land ownership, but supposedly with the divine right of kings at the head, so they're only looking after the land for God. So that was the basis of the feudal system. But of course, many of the people at the top of it weren't actually very godly at all. They were just using God as an excuse. It's an elitist system, certainly, and it was started in 1954, but the roots of it go back 10 years before that into World War II. And nowadays, the Bilderbergs are essentially a collection of the business elite, people who are basically above the law. They own massive amounts of money, more than they could ever, or businesses and assets, more than they could ever use or spend. And they do seriously see themselves as superior to everybody else, almost above the law. So to that extent, it's a kind of political representation of the military aims of NATO, and I think it's become such a powerful bloc, not just the Bilderbergs, but the people that are related to it. I mean, I'm talking about the private clubs now that set foreign policy in the West, like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, Royal Institute for International Affairs here in London. These organisations are very powerful, and they're also wedded a lot of people, the same people in the Bilderberg conference. But Bilderberg is very, very close to the military side. In fact, what we've seen over the last few years is a change in the sorts of people who are being invited along, to include BA. I mean, the interesting thing is, when you look at the list they put out, quite often the military affiliations of individuals, like, for example, Sherard Cowper-Coles, who's been at several Bilderberg conferences now. Certainly he was at the one in Watford a couple of years ago here in Britain. I mean, this guy is BAE Systems, the biggest arms manufacturer in the world, and yet when it's listing him, it doesn't talk about that. It talks about some other kind of spurious thing that he's doing. I don't know, some kind of I think it might be even some sort of job at a college or whatever, So you have to be very careful in interpreting the lists, because quite often the person's main link to NATO and to the war machine is not on the list. But anyway, they've had BAE Systems. They've also had EADS, which is sort of European version, biggest arms manufacturer in Europe, and the people that own Airbus. This is the thing many people don't understand, is a lot of these kind of civilian projects are really steered by people whose main job is the military, and they really do see their job as to extend their markets around the world. This is the problem. It's a bit medieval, really, in that they go out kind of campaigning every spring, where are we going to take over this time, like like the sort of battles between the Muslims and the Christian kings in Spain. Every year it was another campaign to take more territory, more booty, and that's what's going on with places like Iraq, Syria. I mean, but this time the booty is oil and natural resources, natural gas. And this is their bread and butter, because we are in this dreadful financial situation, which drives the sharp end of the economy. That is to say, the not the financial end, but the real end, like the oil exploitation. The people are pumping oil out the ground and moving it around the world to ever extend their resource base. there's a massive drive for that. The governments are always pressing for they want more taxes, and the government will help these big corporations to exploit countries by being the military end of it. So that's basically
Tony,
what
can we just step
Bilderberg's up
back a
to.
little bit and look at the origins of Bilderberg? It was set up by Prince Bernhard, was it not?
Well, there's two characters involved in setting it up: Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands and Joseph Rettinger, who Stephen Dorrell, in his history of MI6, which is an excellent read. I mean, it's a sort of unauthorized history of MI6. He's explains that he was working for MI6. I mean, we kind of knew that because he was the aide to General Sikorski, the Polish general during the war, who died in mysterious circumstances, funnily enough, while Rettinger wasn't on the plane with him, although he was supposed to have been, off Gibraltar. So Rettinger was involved, and I've been chatting to some Polish people here in Bristol, and they say, oh yes, there's a biography come out about him which explains some of his Masonic connections. And it's worth mentioning, I think, right, now that you've got a couple of big Freemason connections to Bilderberg. That's the first one right at the very start there, with Rettinger being a Mason, and connected up with MI6, of course, with this sort of mafiosi style oaths they swear. And the other thing is Andrew Palmer. Now Palmer, he organised the last but one Bilderberg meeting to take place in Britain at Turnberry, and he notes, I got hold of a copy of his CV, and he says, oh yes, I was a personal assistant to the Duke of Kent, who's the Queen's cousin and the Grand Master of World Freemasonry. So, you can see there's some pretty close connections to this sort of thing back in the 1950s when it first started, and right up to the present day.
So how does Bilderberg have a direct effect on those people living in the UK, in Europe?
Well, it doesn't really. It has an indirect effect. I think, Will Hutton described it quite well. He was the editor of The Observer when he was invited, and then he sort of lost his job, and he was kind of been elbowed out into the long grass because he was quite critical in The Observer about the Bilderbergs, calling them the high priests of globalization. The consensus, in inverted commas, reached at Bilderberg is the backdrop against which policy is made worldwide. Now, I think he's kind of over-egging the pudding a bit, because the Chinese and the Russians would probably take issue with that. Yeah, privatisation. I mean, the Irish, for example, are getting it in the neck now with the privatisation of water, with the privatisation of Aer Lingus. All these things are about taking public assets, which are all of ours. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was a big exponent of it here in Britain, and then putting them into private hands. And of course, when they're in private hands, those private individuals can just sort of jack up the price to whatever they feel like, whilst the people are driven into debt. So this is just an elite system. It's rather like the feudal system the Normans brought in, and it's essentially a system of despotism, where the people are just exploited and there is no real democracy. And of course, you may have a little bit of democracy. You're allowed a little bit of democracy so that there's a kind of a bit of a illusion of it. But at the top, all of these things are really being controlled in the NATO countries from the top, from the banks, who majorly feature at Bilderberg, and by these networks of big companies and corporations and private individuals who, they don't have to work for a living, but they do spend quite a lot of time playing golf and chit-chatting about how they're going to exploit and run the rest of us.
But so who are they? Who are these people specifically?
Well, a lot of the names aren't wouldn't be normally recognisable, but I mean certainly some of the major figures behind it. If you look at Europe, you've got the Rothschild family in many different countries in Europe. Of course, France known about quite a lot, in England and London and the city, and Jacob Rothschild particularly in Britain. It was Victor Rothschild. He was a Labour peer back in the 1970s and 80s, and he was basically advising all governments. He was also, if you read Spycatcher, you'll see appointing people to the heads of the Secret Service. But he's involved I mean, MI6 and MI5. Basically, Mr. Rothschild knows who should be in charge, and in the US, it's the Rockefeller family, very powerful banking family. They were oil monopolists, but then they moved into banking, and I suppose in the military side of things, you can point to Henry Kissinger. I mean, he's a real operator. He's also one of the sort of big Bilderberg characters. His company, Kissinger Associates, you could characterize that as like the world's biggest protection racket, where, say, there's a conflict going on in the border somewhere in Africa, and you go to the UN, you say, well, we need something doing about this, a president, whatever, of Malawi or somewhere, and you get nowhere with the United Nations because they're pretty toothless, and also because the Security Council is dominated by the US, and who veto everything that's not in their own interests, including the most ridiculous stuff. Anyway, then what you do is you pick up the phone to Henry Kissinger. You get your £1 million credit card out, and then you could start to negotiate with him about what's going to happen and what you have to do in order to stop the killing in your country. And we've now got to the situation, I think, with the Western world, that you've got a killing machine going around to places like Iraq. I mean, the balkanization of the Middle East. Dan Glazebrook, a chap I knew when I was living in Oxford, and he's now a terrific writer. He what he's calling it is divide and ruin. So there isn't even the interest of divide and rule and running countries now. What's happening is that the West is simply able to deny those countries to the Russians and the Chinese as their sphere of influence, because the country is in such utter chaos. So it seems all we are able to do really in the West now. And you look, Libya is a perfect example of this. Syria is that the country's been turned into a total chaos state where people need to get away. You cannot survive there. You need to get your belongings, your family, and get out. And it really annoys me to see the way that the news media at the moment is talking about all this stuff in the Mediterranean as they're calling them migrants. Listen, you cannot stay in an area where you cannot live. Yeah, so you're not a migrant. I mean, a lot of these people are from Central African Republic and Mali, and they were having a reasonable life. A lot of them in Libya as guest workers or whatever under Gaddafi. There's now just complete chaos there, and they've just got to get out.
Well, that's right, and there seems to be a deliberate action within the Middle East to go in and cause absolute havoc. Now, why would the ruling elite want that as a first question?
Well, it certainly suits the interests of the Israelis, because they are surrounded by millions and millions of Arabs who, I mean, there's a big cultural, difference between the European Jews that have come into Israel, largely because of Britain and the Balfour Declaration and the Palestinian mandate we had between the wars and during the Second World War. And what it's doing is it's completely disrupting any kind of resistance that there might be in the Middle East to Israeli expansion. I mean, the Israelis, obviously, in 1967, they occupied loads of territory which wasn't theirs. And the US veto was used in the United Nations to make sure that they kept it, and that's still a running sore, in Palestine, in Gaza, and the West Bank. But it's a much wider problem. It's being expanded around the Middle East now, and there's very little in our press which I think looks at the bigger picture, which is that much of the military intervention that Britain's been up to, and the US and France and other NATO countries in the Middle East has directly benefited the Israelis. It just seems we've got a kind of, it's funny, but there's the same countries that are doing these drone killings and are really into the idea of this remote controlled drone hellfire missile death, which is actually war crimes, is the US, Israel and Britain. Actually, the Germans are involved in this quite a lot as well, as The Intercept pointed out a few weeks ago. The Ramstein base in Germany is a big hub for these drone killings. So,
So
you know,
it's interesting you bring in the Germans because there's clearly a right-wing Nazi element towards Bilderberg, and people who aren't aware should look up Operation Paperclip post Second World War. And I don't know whether you can go into the Nazi links to the leading elites.
I mean, yes, it's an important thing for people to understand. I mean, first of all, none of the general press coverage on Bilderberg, does links them to the Nazis, which they really must be linked to. I mean, this is the thing that shocked me when I was first looking into them in Oxford, and the libraries there was seeing that Prince Bernhard, in his own biography, admits to being in the SS, and that to me was like a red rag to a bull, I suppose, when you see that this organisation that already looks suspicious with all these banks, royalty, all the most powerful, richest, most annoying people, I suppose, the sort of people that you wouldn't really want to invite round for tea, their links to being, their organisation being chaired by a former SS officer for the first 20 years, Prince Bernhard. That was pretty clearly something wrong there. But you start looking into Bernhard and you realise that his role in the Battle of Arnhem, as it's called, Operation Market Garden in September 1944, was pretty crucial in that he was a former SS officer. He married into the Dutch royal family just before the beginning of the war. And then as the war broke out, he threw up his hands and said, "Oh gosh, isn't it terrible, these nasty Germans?" And he came into exile in Britain. And I think some of the family went over to Canada too. But he was then saying, "Oh, these Nazis are terrible," even though he had been an ex-SS officer himself. And King George VI asked Ian Fleming to sign off his security clearance, and he was allowed to be part of the liberation of Holland, because he was saying, "Oh, I'm actually on your side now, guys. I'm not an SS officer anymore." And he was given access to the plans of Operation Market Garden behind the scenes in London, and there's amazing pictures of him peering over the shoulder of Monty and Brian Horrocks, who was the general in charge of the ground forces and Operation. The film is A Bridge Too Far, which you may have seen, but Bernhard particularly, he's quite clearly not on our side. He's a spy right at the very top. For example, the United States Army wouldn't have him anywhere near them. They refused to allow him to see any of their plans or even come to any of their bases or whatever. And the same with the Royal Navy. Even though, of course, Ian Fleming was, naval intelligence, the Royal Navy wouldn't even talk to Bernhard. So there was a resistance within the British establishment and the US establishment side of the war to having anything to do with the guy.
However, Tony, let me just jump in there. The Nazis were funded pre-war by the Americans and the Brits, okay, and they couldn't actually fly their planes or run the tanks without a certain oil from Standard Oil, okay, and that came from the Bush family.
Well, that's right.
That's my research.
That's right. I mean, there were deals done. Bush was interred during the war, and also the Rockefeller family gave the patents or the information about how to make synthetic rubber to the Nazis, because they didn't have any access to rubber to make tires with. So there was definitely, for a long time there was that liaison. But I mean, at this Arnhem battle particularly, Bernhard sent in this spy about a week before the battle, or a few days before the battle, in order to liaise by parachute, or I think maybe he was smuggled across the front line, I'm not sure. This guy, Christian Lindemans, who was nicknamed King Kong, and he went into Holland to really pre-warn the Dutch resistance that this massive airborne assault was coming with the 1st Airborne Division in Arnhem, all around Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne Division, Eindhoven, the 101st US Airborne Division. This massive airborne assault, I think it's probably still the biggest airborne assault in history, in September 1944 was coming. Operation Market Garden, A Bridge Too Far, the Arnhem Battle, and yet King Kong, Christian Lindemans, this so-called wonderful agent of Bernhard, went straight to the Abwehr and handed over the plans of Operation Market Garden and what he knew about it, which he was supposed to be talking to the Dutch resistance about, straight over to the Nazis. Now, that does indicate, doesn't it, that Bernhard was not to be trusted if he's the guy he thought was going to do this crucial job. Anyway, so 10 years after that battle, which was an absolute massacre, and also Lord Carrington was involved in it on the ground at Nijmegen Bridge. He was part of the ground forces that did not go to Arnhem, even though the Americans had taken the Nijmegen Bridge. And this is depicted very well by Robert Redford in the film A Bridge Too Far. Is that the Americans took the Nijmegen Bridge, great cost to themselves, amazing assault on the bridge, and yet the British just sat around twiddling their thumbs in their tanks and didn't go to Arnhem, and they could have saved the day. Carrington was the man there, and he was sitting in his tank, and Moffat Burris, who was a captain in the 82nd Airborne Division, told me, he said, I pointed my Tommy gun at Carrington's head and told him, if you don't go down that blankety blank road right now, I'm going to blow your blankety blank head off, because I've just lost all my men taking this bridge, and you're sitting around doing nothing, and your guys are hurting down there at Arnhem. And so Carrington was involved in, I think, in throwing the battle. And this is why it's very, very hot potato politically, Arnhem. And also interesting, isn't it, that the place, the Witch's Cauldron in Oosterbeek, which is where the British 1st Airborne Division was surrounded and massacred at Arnhem, which the Germans called the Witch's Cauldron, the Hexenkessel, that was where 10 years after the war, the Bilderberg's first meeting in the Bilderberg Hotel took place. And I think that's an in-joke, basically.
Yeah.
And also the fact that the battle was thrown was crucial for the Nazis, because they'd had the Red House meeting in Strasbourg just a couple of months before, which was in order to get moving their succession network after the war. That is to say, to get all of the loot that they'd taken from Europe, from all the capitals, all the central banks of Europe, the art treasures, the securities and everything, and squirrel it away for use after the war. And they needed those several months. And if the Arnhem battle had been successful, it could have brought an end to the war by Christmas. Many of the people I've spoken to who were involved in the battle did believe that, because they would have cut the German supply lines by getting a bridgehead over the Rhine into the Ruhr. It would have been an absolute nightmare. It was a very good plan of Monty's, and it nearly succeeded, despite the fact it was sabotaged. So I think the Red House meeting, combined with the Battle of Arnhem, gives you a really good picture of the connections between the Nazis and certain traitors in the British Army, like Carrington and Bernhard, and possibly others too. But those were the main ones.
Therefore, Tony, you're suggesting that the Bilderberg Group, the current Bilderberg Group, is the corporate front-facing side of the Nazi Party that never lost the Second World War, or is that incorrect?
It certainly seems to have some connections. But look, I mean, one of the most important things to understand here is that the attack on communism, I don't think, has had anything to do over the years, on the Soviets and this sort of Cold War, anything really to do with anything ideological, like they are dangerous or they are atheists or whatever. It's just because they don't want their big corporations taken off of them. And that's what communist governments do, and socialist governments sometimes do, is they nationalise. Yeah, they will take off your big business off you, which you've been making a fortune, where you can buy nice big cars and prostitutes or whatever it is you choose, and yachts, and they will take that off you and make you just like anybody else. So that's the fear, is that that these ideologies, these political ideas, have got to be stopped, because then we stop being this elite and we stop being above the law anymore.
Okay, so where does that take us to 2015? What do you think is going to be discussed in Austria next week?
Well, one of the things that's always on the agenda, I think, is general sort of privatisation. So the stuff that's going on in Ireland right now, the asset stripping of Greece. I mean, it's quite interesting. So I met the Greek finance minister at the Bilderberg conference back in, and I'm thinking, which one was it? It was in Versailles in 2003, and he'd come out of the Bilderberg meeting saying, God, the atmosphere in that place is terrible, the cigarettes are really expensive, I need to come out and get a proper cup of coffee and sit in a cafe with all you lot, and it was just lucky that there were just a couple of us covering the conference, sitting outside, and we sat and had a coffee with. I mean, I was thinking, this is the Greek finance minister we're chit-chatting with here, and he even tried to smuggle us out a list of the participants, and he was searched and stopped on the way out. So you can see, this is, a lot of the people who are there from the politics side are under duress and pressure. So I mean, we can't totally condemn our politicians, because in a way they're all we've got. Yeah. Also, of course, what's been going on in Ukraine, they'll be discussing that kind of thing, and also in the Middle East and Syria. That kind of thing's always on the agenda. But I think particularly control of the news, they're very interested in that. Controlling, Twitter, Facebook, Google particularly, which seems ever more wedded to the CIA, basically giving the intelligence services, the crooked criminal intelligence services, backdoors into our living rooms. And, as Edward Snowden has exposed, this is just an appalling abuse of power. I'd also point to Edwin Black's book, IBM and the Holocaust, where he points out that the technology was a very important part and information gathering of the Nazis' campaign to slaughter the Jews.
Well, that's right, but because the Nazis were at the front end of the growing corporate position from America and the Anglo-American corporation, which is run predominantly by the banks and the Zionists. And they developed a strategy to create this anger and hatred towards their own people. And everything is backwards, and that's my point.
Well, I think actually what it was a bit more complicated than that is that the real assault from Hitler was mostly on people who were quite, followed the Abrahamic tradition, because you can be ethnically Jewish but not really care much about it. And in fact, some of the people involved in the banking sector who were kind of responsible for Hitler's coming to power were either Jewish or connected with Jewish people. And so there was quite a selective thing going on there. I mean, I think it should be obvious to anyone that with two brain cells to put together that the attack on Islam now is exactly mirrors this attack on the Jews back in the 1930s. That there's all sorts of front organisations been set up by the intelligence services mainly, but by others, by foreign powers here in Britain, who just come into Britain and do what they want, to sort of mimic an Islamic group. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about things like the Quilliam Foundation, who are, they are just a pretend version, but they're the one you will see on the TV every night. The same exact thing happens with, I was mentioning Chatham House and the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations earlier. It's people in these organisations who are supposedly the best spokespeople that we see on TV all the time and listen to on the radio. They're doing the interpretation, but they're working against us. So there's no kind of attempt to get independent voices in the press anymore. I mean, we're just with this FIFA scandal, for example, we've seen recently. There's been nobody I've heard anywhere saying the obvious, which is, isn't this the politicisation of football? We don't really want the US, who don't even play football, although they pretend to, but they keep losing, so they invented their own game, which works quite nicely around the advertising breaks. This has all come from the FBI and from the corruption going on in the North American branch of FIFA. And it's been cooperating with the Swiss as well, Swiss police, which is really interesting because, of course, there's lots of connections between Nazi gold in Switzerland and the US, and Switzerland sort of sees itself as kind of above all this, but it's not. It's it's deeply wedded to the US power and cooperated with the Nazis. The most powerful bank in the world, the Bank for International Settlements, is in Switzerland, and they are part of that exact same. They were doing foreign exchange for Hitler. They were, after the Second World War, there was an attempt to close the Bank for International Settlements down. There was an agreement to do it, but it never happened. They're still there. Mark Carney, who's now the governor of the Bank of England, he was one of the key people right in the centre of all the regulation committees and the governance committees at the Bank for International Settlements. These people run the global banking system. So they're not, shall we say, the Swiss are not independent at all. They are right in the centre of things, and this is it. I find this whole FIFA business really just a. It looks to me like regime change, controlling an international organisation, because the US and Britain and the Western powers and NATO cannot bear to see any international institution which is truly independent and will treat a little country like Cameroon the same as they'll treat Britain. They want to be dominant in all these areas.
Well, that's very interesting. So you think that the stories of Blatter being bribed, etc., are just rumours, and you think it's got nothing to do with the fact that Russia are going to hold the next World Cup 2016?
Well, of course, this is an attack on the. I mean, it's very important to the Yanks, particularly Americans, to control what happens during that World Cup. Blatter, as an independent-minded person, I mean, they've been saying they want Prince Ali to do this job, but he's been trained at Sandhurst. He's a Jordanian general who would have been involved and known about the training of ISIS, which was going on in Jordan, and the Syrian rebels that was going on in Jordan, and the arming and equipping of them. They played a big part in this sort of second wave assault on. And the first wave assault on Syria by the West, and this put this guy at the top of FIFA is just beyond a joke. I mean, he's a military commander who's been doing all sorts of dirty work for NATO in the Middle East, in leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, mass migration, and he's going to run FIFA. There's no criticism of it at all, and there's not even a hint in the media over here that I've seen anyway, that this is putting a general in charge of FIFA that's loyal to Sandhurst, the British military, and the British arms industry and the US arms industry. Just beyond a joke. Why has there not been any kind of discussion of this? I mean, this just shows you to what extent the media is controlled, I think, the London media, and why we need some more diversity.
How does Bilderberg affect British politics?
Well, I mean, you can see that, for example, the Watford meeting, you can see there's Ed Balls there. Now he's lost his seat. But, I mean, basically they have all aspects, all the main three political parties. Shirley Williams went, and everyone was saying, oh, well, Shirley Williams, but she's a nice fluffy bunny, no problem. Look, hang on a minute. Shirley Williams was played a key role in making sure the Lib Dems supported the Health and Social Care Act, which it was all about privatising and crippling the National Health Service. So she's no shrinking violet when it comes to crushing the most important national institution Britain has ever created, and most people would argue. And so, yeah, it's all to do with privatisation. The politicians essentially don't seem to do very well if they don't really support the Bilderbergs. And John Smith went along, I think it was 1991, I'm not sure exactly of the year, when he was leader of the Labour Party, and was very critical of it, started banging his fist on the table, this kind of thing, and he was never invited back. And in fact, he wanted to bring, I don't know if it was Brian Gould or somebody who was a very good economist, saying, look, you need a lecture in economics because you don't understand what you're talking about. I'd love to see some economist like Steve Keen, who wrote Debunking Economics, given a presentation at Bilderberg, because these people need a proper education, because all they're doing is they're using the financial system to get everybody into debt, chain us to computers. This is a William Cooper quote, actually. I don't know if you've come across him, a US naval intelligence guy who did a radio show in the US, who Alex Jones sort of rather poorly mimics him. He was saying that that's basically what they want, a system of eternal oppressive debt where everyone is chained to a computer for the rest of their life, and a propagandized world, media controlled, so that people think that they're happy in that system. They don't know any different. So a lot of this is to do with dumbing down, is sort of de-educating people and making sure that that people do not get aware of what's going on in the world. But the trouble is, of course, that people are getting aware, and they're getting less and less faith in the system.
Well, that's right. There is an awakening, but it's very small. People don't even know what Bilderberg is, most of people.
Well, I don't agree. No, I don't agree. I think it's actually here in Britain. I mean, look, we had the Bilderberg conferences I went to back in 2000, 2003. there was just literally like three protesters and maybe two journalists. Although we managed to get the front page of one of the Belgian newspapers, we've just phoned the right people. We were on the front page Saturday's one of the national papers in Belgium, and the whole press was down on Saturday lunchtime, which was brilliant. So that's all you need is just a little tiny bit blip. Um, handful of protesters, handful of journalists. Well, look, when it happened to the conference here in Britain in 2013 at Watford, Cameron went, the rest of them. Osborne, obviously, this is the Bullingdon Club, basically, isn't it? Going en masse down to, the people who have been to Eton and then been told at Oxford you're going to rule the world, and then now they do. That in that particular case at Watford, I think we saw everybody sort of turning up on there. I mean, Cameron is supposed to regulate this stuff because they're not allowed to go to these meetings. In the US, it's a criminal offence.
Yeah,
But anyway,
Tony, let me just interject there. You're talking about 3,000 people at Watford. That was a pretty good turnout. But you're talking about seven.
Well, it was.
You're talking about 7 billion people on the
it's
planet.
it's more than 3,000. I mean, 3,000 people got in. There was something like 3,000 turned away. So we had actually more people turned away from the Bilderberg conference that happened in Watford than have ever been to a Bilderberg conference at any time previously, all added together.
But still, this is the fact about the population on this planet. People believe that if they vote left, they're going to get a different solution. Okay, they're going to get a different outcome.
No, they don't anymore. I don't think. I mean, I think some do.
Why do they keep voting then?
People don't.
Why do they keep voting? People said to me, if Ed Miliband, if only we had David Miliband in, then it would have been different. It's absolute sham. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make a difference whether you go left or right, because you still get governments.
Yeah, you're completely wrong about that, I'm afraid. It does make a difference because in Britain, the Conservative Party is by far more of a representative of the ruling elite. Now, you're going to get a different flavour. I mean, maybe some of the policies, for example, to do with international stuff, may be the same from both sides, although, of course, it was actually Miliband that stopped, almost single-handed with the Labour Party, the attack on Syria after the fake Ghouta supposedly done by Assad chemical weapons attack.
I know,
it was the Labour Party
Tony.
that stopped
that's actually spot on, but nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. The attack on Syria. Hang on. Let me just interject. The attack on Syria has been delayed, but still, ISIS is still a creation. So what happens is we have this system. And you have Ed Miliband standing up, being very left wing, and we're going to do it for the people, and we reduce taxes and so on and so forth. But we're still paying taxes. We're paying taxes to bankers who are printing their own money. So I would be a very rich man if I could create money and you've got to pay tax. You've got to pay an interest rate on that money that doesn't actually exist. So it's different variations within the same system, and they're still going to go into Syria. They're already in Syria. That's the point. They're in Syria. They're using ISIS as a cover. They're bombing ISIS closer and closer to Damascus. And so we can say we can bring in this person and that person, but it makes no difference. The system at some point has to come down.
What you're doing here is you're really misunderstanding the way politics works, because there's quite a big difference actually between what you would get as for example, a Labour majority government as what you would get from a Conservative majority government. For example, I mean, you can talk about now, but you could also look back at the Thatcher era and how much material was moved from the public ownership into private ownership during those years is absolutely colossal, and it wouldn't have been the same if Labour had been in. If you're looking now,
what's a load of rubbish? Look at what Tony Blair did. Look at what Tony Blair did from a Labour perspective. He was the best thing that happened to the Conservatives at that time. Tony Blair. He sold his soul to the bankers and is still doing so. And he was the leader of the Labour Party. It makes no difference whatsoever.
Well, you're completely wrong about that. It does make a difference, and even if it's just delaying something, that's much, much better. And it's important for people to have a chance to understand, cope with, and deal with things, rather than to just be having assault led by the rich and ruling classes. There is actually quite a lot. I mean, for example, look at what's happened in Scotland. You've got a very big difference in Scotland with the attitude of the SNP towards elderly care, social care, this kind of thing in Scotland. It's a big, big difference. So, I mean, you're falling into a great big man trap there by saying it doesn't make any difference which way you vote, because it does, simply does. And
No, I don't think I am at all.
you
And
are.
and
So you are.
and the ruling elite still push through their government policies, whether they get it the first time or the second time. They just CISPAs is an example, and you do not become a leading politician unless you are given the go-ahead by the elite, and unless you're willing to at some point work within the system.
Well,
The whole thing is a mirage.
No, it's not a total mirage. There is some democracy, vestiges of democracy left, and I think also what you're doing is you're actually making a mistake which has been designed for people to make. This whole idea of apathy about whether there's any point in voting or not is an important part of their program. They want people not to vote. They want people to give up on engaging in politics in that way. And even if I'm not saying that the vote that you cast once every 5 years is the only way of engaging in politics. It certainly shouldn't be and isn't, but it is an important little part of actually making a difference. And don't believe it's going to make, maybe it might just delay the disaster, but it is an important signal to send to your fellow human beings that you think that this is a certain way that things should run, and it's a way of voting maybe for something which is less selfish. So there are differences. I mean, look for example at look at the politics of Ireland, for example. There's a ruling elite in Ireland, but they're having a lot more difficulty in getting the natural resources of Ireland into their own private hands, and that's largely because there's a more engagement in politics. So this disengagement from politics is exactly what the elite want.
No, I'm not talking about a disengagement from politics. I'm saying that the system that we have grown up in and we live within is the same whether you go left or right. It's dominated by the people who are in power, who are able to control the flow of currency. Now that's a fact, okay? That's a fact. So, why Britain should be wealthier than, say, Libya right now, or why we as free people in the West, we believe that our armies going around killing people is democracy, in the name of democracy, which it clearly isn't. Whether it's Conservatives or whether it's Labour, it's the same army, it's the same method, it's the same methodology, it's the same evil. And it's right at the top that we have to change. It makes no long-standing difference if we vote in a different colour of tyranny. It makes no difference whatsoever. It may do to the middle class. We may get a few years, and we've coming out of a good few years where the middle class has prospered. But those days are over. The days of the middle-class British person who enjoys a good standing of living, they're coming to an end very, very dramatically. As you've quite rightly pointed out, most of the UK's heavily in debt on one level or another. And when that base rate starts to come up, we're going to see some specific trauma within the United Kingdom, and we're already seeing the screws being turned in the United States of America as they bring down the last true democracy quite cleverly. And I believe, probably wrongly, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, that a lot of these directives come from the Bilderberg group.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it even comes from there, because there are other organisations. The Bilderbergers really is just a way of schmoozing and trying to get people on side and assessing which politicians are going to take over, and which are going to be good to have as an opposition leader, for example, and so they can meet people face to face, build relationships, and also, as we saw in Copenhagen last year. Basically, George Osborne gets a lecture. He's being told, "You're going to do this, you're going to do that, aren't you?" Yeah, and he knows that if he steps out of line, he'll be splashed across the Daily Mail with pictures of him snorting cocaine and God knows what. But I mean, yeah, because some of the I just think that the Conservative Party, for example, let's just take this child sexual abuse scandal, for example. The Conservative Party is far more embroiled in that, and a lot of these people are much closer to the Tory Party than the Labour Party, for example. Your characterisation of all political parties are the same is just lazy thinking, effectively. I mean, these political parties. I mean, and I interview these MPs, these MEPs, the local councillors every week. And you can see there are differences between how much they really care about us. And for example, the Conservatives are very reluctant even sometimes to come on my radio show to talk. Because they are basically the Tory party, the elite party of the country, and they represent those financial interests from the City of London, which fought the landed gentry during the English Civil War, and won, and turned Britain into the first kind of massive capitalist country in the world. One of the big take homes for Bilderberg is just look at all the tech companies there. These Googles, people like that. That they love it. And you can see that they're. It's a bit like the sort of Bond villains convention, and they love the idea that these people might back them with another massive project. Because I mean, basically, what you're doing there is you're meeting the people who can finance your next big nightmare dream. The only thing is, they will own that big nightmare dream. And these tech companies, I think, since the revelations from Edward Snowden, which, by the way, came out right in the middle of the Bilderberg conference happening here in Britain, the first Snowden stories. Which I think was actually quite significant, even if it's just providence. The fact that it happened during a Bilderberg meeting is quite fantastic. But, it just shows you that you've got this kind of technocracy now in the technical world. And deregulation just simply means you've got effectively a fascist system growing, a police state growing, where there are no real checks and balances on the police. And there's this whole elite cult, effectively, that can do what they want, and they don't stand any chance of going to jail. And I mean, I would definitely point at Freemasonry as a potential big part of that, because the oaths that these people swear are to each other. They're not to serve the public. So no Freemason, in my view, should be allowed to take any public position because of the oaths they've sworn to their own cult. And that is, there's all these rules about probity to do with, even small businesses and big businesses. But nobody ever mentions the secret societies and the Freemasons, because they are the biggest threat to our liberty, I think, through their secret organisations, the oaths they swear that they never want to talk about. I've asked one of the UKIP guys here in Bristol recently about it, and he said, "Oh, I can't tell you what oaths I've sworn." But hang on, but you just said it's not a secret society. Oh, well, I can't talk about that, And that's essentially what they're doing. Is they're doing it? They have a noose around their neck. They have a dagger to their bare chest, and then they swear oaths of secrecy. And effectively, it's a threat of death. So anyone that's going through a ritual, which is a kind of little pantomime of you being killed, if you step out of line, I mean, of course, that concentrates the mind, and we shouldn't have people like that in our politics or in any kind of public life at all.